Any other questions? That all makes sense? So the exam is 100 multiple choice questions. It's on respiratory and digestive. It is not over the metabolic chapter, metabolism chapter, which for years and years around here we've always covered the metabolic chapter on the first test, but we're not doing it this time, so it'll be covered on the second test as well. Not a big deal. It's a one-day chapter. And it's another one of those chapters which I tell you that, you know, listen to what I say. If I don't talk about it, it won't be on the test. So it can be a very complicated, very huge chapter, but I sort of limit it by what I talk about. Okay? The stomach. I think we were talking about the stomach already. We talked about the different types of cells, the chief cells and the parietal cells and what they make and what they secrete. And you remember there's these chief cells, which are kind of the main kind of cells. Then there's the G cells, they make gastrin. I'm not sure we've talked about that yet. And then the parietal cells, which make pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid, I believe. Oh, here it is. Yes, the parietal cells secrete intrinsic factor and hydrochloric acid, and the chief cells secrete hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. Okay, and remember, pepsinogen is a precursor of pepsin, and pepsin is a enzyme that breaks down peptide bonds, breaks down proteins, and so forth. So the reason we make it as pepsinogen and keep it inactive until it gets out in the stomach is because you really wouldn't want it eating up your pancreas. You know, as it's traveling through your pancreas, you would like it to be inactive. Once it gets out into the stomach and it's protected from the wall by that sheet of mucus, remember, it's okay for it to be active out there, and that's where it does its work. Okay, and I think we did talk about this too, the chloride shift. Enough. So pepsinogen, when it comes in contact with the HCl out in the lumen of the stomach, it turned into the active form, which is pepsin. Pyloric glands. These are kind of cool because they do several things for us. First of all, they're located right in the pylorus, and you should see those on the microscope, the duodenal glands. They produce a lot of mucus. Now think about it. Here's this duodenum. It's sitting there, and it's got all this really acid stuff flowing out of the stomach into the duodenum. Now you would think it would just burn a hole in the duodenal wall, which is what an ulcer is, really. That's where duodenal ulcers form. Although we now know they're caused by a bacteria called H. pylori, they're actually still, acid is part of the problem. So they have these extra glands in the wall of the duodenum in order to protect themselves from that really acid stuff that's coming in. There is also a couple of specialized, I guess, you know what, I'm talking about the duodenum, I want to be talking about the pylorus. The pylorus is the distal part of the stomach, okay? Let me go back and rephrase what I just said. What we're talking about here is the distal part of the stomach. It makes lots of mucus. It's scattered with these enteroendocrine cells that make gastrin. Now what is gastrin? Gastrin is the #1 enzyme that signals to the stomach, hey, we've got some food down here, we need to digest it, make more gastrin. Make more gastrin makes it make more acid, makes the stomach really churn out the enzymes. It also, the distal part of the stomach, the pylorus, secretes somatostatin, which is a hormone that inhibits the release of gastrin. Now, this sounds really confusing to you at this point, but just wait a minute, I'll show you a complex slide that then I hope to break down and make it easier for you as far as the regulation of gastric activity, because that's what's really important here. Okay, there's 3 phases to gastric secretion. The first phase is when you walk into the restaurant. So you walk into the restaurant, you smell all these wonderful smells, you look at the other people that are eating and the food that's on their plate, and you think, man, that looks good, and your brain says, whoa, we're getting ready to have a good meal here, let's start making some acid, and let's start making some pepsin, and let's churn out all that stuff into our stomach so it'll be ready to receive this food and digest it. Does that make sense? Now that message is carried from the brain. That message is entirely created up here in the brain. That's why they call it the cephalic phase in the head, right? And that message is carried down to the stomach by a nerve that we call the wandering nerve, which is we call the 10th vagus, the vagus nerve, okay? And so as a result of that, we used to go in as surgery and cut the vagus nerve in order to cut down on the amount of acid made by the stomach. If you could cut out the cephalic phase, you could lower the amount of acid made by the stomach, and hopefully you could help cure ulcers. And, you know, in my career, I probably did 50 vagotomies, where you make an incision, you go up there and get around your fingers around the end of the esophagus, pull it up, you feel for the vagus nerves, pull them up, cut them. Yeah?
So just by smelling food, your stomach will secrete acids?
Absolutely.
So if you don't have a sense of smell, you'd be a lot less likely to develop these.
Well, maybe so.
ulcers.
I don't know about a lot less, but you would be a little bit less, yes. You wouldn't make as much. Okay, the second phase is called the gastric phase. When the food gets to your stomach, now you've sat down at the restaurant, you're eating this lovely food, and the food goes straight down to your stomach after you chewed it up a little bit. That causes your stomach to expand, which then causes the stomach to stretch a little bit. And as it stretches, especially the distal part or the pyloric part of the stomach, when it stretches, it causes the release of more gastrin. Gastrin tells you to make more acid, make more of these enzymes. So that's the gastric phase, which is basically caused by filling up of the stomach and a little bit of stretching of the wall of the stomach. And then finally, you have this intestinal phase. Now, 2 hours later, after you've sat there and enjoyed that lovely meal, and you're headed home, and the food, it's been just churning in your stomach for about 2 hours, and now it starts being released, and it's going on into the duodenum through the pyloric valve and going on downstream. What do you think, what kind of signals do you think are going to be released then? They're going to be slowed down a little bit here. Quit making so much acid, because you've got the food and it's starting to pass out of the stomach. So the intestinal phase is really sort of a way to tell the stomach itself to quit making so much acid, because things are starting to show up down in the intestine. Okay, so how does this work? Well, let's go through these little pictures. And I think if I don't go through that first bit with you, these really get confusing, but hopefully they won't. So here's the cephalic phase. You smell, you taste the food, you think about food like I do all the time, and a message comes down your vagus nerve. It spreads around, this message is sent, it's a parasympathetic, right? Parasympathetic, rest and digest, right? We're going to digest here. It sends messages out to all of these different kinds of cells. It tells the mucus cells to make mucus, tells the chief cells to make pepsinogen, tells the parietal cells to make hydrochloric acid, and it goes to the G cells, and the G cells start to make more gastrin. That's right. Part 2, the gastric phase. Notice the picture. The stomach is now kind of filled up. It's distended, and so the distension of the stomach causes these stretch receptors to signal back over here to make more of this stuff. Because you got food in it, we're stretching it out. Let's make more of these mucus, more pepsinogen, more hydrochloric acid, and these chemoreceptors. Because as you do all of this, the pH becomes more elevated because you've neutralized it a little bit with the food, right? What acid you had is being neutralized a little bit, and so that's also telling you. It's also sending the message over here, and the red arrows are stimulation. Understand that from the diagram here. The red means stimulation. So it stimulates the stomach to make more of all of these things in the gastric phase of stomach digestion. Yes?
So first there was a vagus nerve, stimulates the stomach to release all the cells, secrete the enzymes. And the second time would be the cells of the stomach, like the
That's right.
stress receptors and all.
That's right. These guys are releasing these enteroendocrine hormones
From stomach.
from the stomach wall itself, yes.
To
And
digest the food.
to tell you to make more enzymes to digest the food. That's right. Okay? So then you start mixing it up, and that's mixing all this up. And gastrin has been created because the stomach was stretched down here. And through the bloodstream, you see that gastrin, which was released out into your bloodstream, starts coming back and telling these guys to make more enzymes as well. So the gastric phase is once again just stimulating the stomach to make more acid, release more enzymes to digest this food. Then the third phase is the intestinal phase, and now you notice that the stomach is starting to empty, and the food is starting to empty into your duodenum and your intestine down here, and several things start happening that are different. Now you've got, down here in the wall of the duodenum, you have 3 hormones that are released. You need to know about these 3 guys, because they are released by the wall of the duodenum. And the wall of the duodenum secretes CCK, which is cholecystokinin. I'll talk about that in a little bit. GIP, gastrointestinal peptide, and secretin. Now wait a minute, what does secretin mean? Well, secretin is a hormone that is released by the wall of the duodenum, and secretin is it's a hormone that's being released that sends signals back here to the stomach, and it says, wait a minute, we've got acidy food down here in the duodenum. The food is starting to leave. Quit making so much acid up there. So it says, quit making so much acid, and that's why you see these are blue lines, and they start to inhibit the chief cells, the parietal cells, and it also starts to decrease the amount of peristalsis so it doesn't keep dumping it all out into the small bowel, into the duodenum. Okay? What?
The secretion was in the stomach wall or the
Duodenal wall. Yeah.
So all of the 3 hormones tell the stomach to start making acid.
Well, I haven't gotten into the other 2 yet.
Oh, okay,
I've just been talking about the secretin so far.
Secretin only,
Yeah. Okay. So also, you've got some stretch receptors in the duodenum. So as the duodenum starts to fill with food and be stretched a little bit, that causes this enterogastric reflex, which sends an inhibitory message up here to the myenteric plexus in order to tell the myenteric plexus, tell the stomach to quit squeezing down so hard and tell it to quit making so much acid and stuff. Okay? Because the stomach is now emptying and that food is starting to show up down here in the duodenum and we're sick of it. We don't want any more. Okay? Now let's talk about secretin for just a minute while we're at it. Because remember, this stuff up here in the stomach has got a pH of 1 to 2 to 3. It's really acidy, right? And as that stuff starts coming down here into the duodenum says, wait a minute, we don't like acid in the duodenum. We don't like it. So that's why some of these messages are sent to slow down that process of dumping that acid out into the stomach. But also, it tells the secretin is a hormone that goes straight to the pancreas. It's not on this picture here, but I'm putting the cart in front of the horse a little bit. But it's saying to the pancreas, Mr. Pancreas, we've got all this acid down here. Would you please make some bicarb to neutralize that acid so we won't have a lot of acid in our intestine? Because we want, by the time the food gets to about this point right here, we want it to be neutralized. We want it to be a pH of 7, so it can go the rest of the way through the bowel at 7. Okay? So secretin is a stimulant that goes to the pancreas that says secrete bicarb. And indeed, pancreatic secretions are pretty alkaline. They have a lot of bicarb in them, as well as a bunch of enzymes in them too. Yeah?
What happens if the acid isn't successfully neutralized and you pass a low pH to the rest of the intestines?
Well, it's going to make you feel not very good. It's going to race on through your bowel. It's probably going to go through so fast through your bowel you won't get to absorb a lot of it. You really need your pancreas to be working. If your pancreas is not working, that's kind of what happens. Things pass through so quickly that oftentimes you're pooping fat. And the last thing you ever want to do is poop fat. Well, I would like to poop fat. But the fact is, your body has gone to the effort to get that food and eat it and digest it. You want to get what's good out of it, so you want to be able to absorb that. In order to do that, you need those lipases and so forth from the pancreas. Yeah?
Does the duodenum have adventitia around it?
Part of the posterior wall does, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, the second and third portions of the duodenum are mainly retroperitoneal.
Okay.
That's your question.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of complex, but if you think about it, it's all really pretty simple. And there's the nice little drawn-out explanation of it that I don't want to go over. Now, a couple of things here further about the stomach. We do a lot of digestion of our proteins in the stomach, okay? Because we do some, because we have pepsin in there. Remember, the pepsin is secreted by the cells in the wall of the stomach, and that pepsin turns from pepsinogen into pepsin and starts breaking down those proteins. We have some lipids that are broken down in the stomach by the lipases from the salivary gland in the mouth. Remember the pharyngeal salivary gland, or not the pharyngeal, but parotid and sublingual and submandibular. Very good. They're making a little lingual lipase that is helping to start breaking down those fats. And remember, there's been a little bit of carbohydrate breaking down because of the salivary amylase is secreted up there as well. Okay, so as the stomach fills with food, as we get food in the stomach is mixed more and more with water. So even though you may have been just eating potato chips and not drinking beer with it or a Coke with it, you're just eating potato chips, it's pouring out a lot of water into the stomach to allow this stuff to all dissolve and start being broken down. The pH gets close to 2, even to 1 sometimes when it's really acid. The pepsin activity increases, the proteins start being broken down. And the point for you to know is that although digestion occurs in the stomach, and although these big long carbohydrates and these big long proteins and these big long fats are being broken down, they are not being absorbed into your body. Okay? They are staying right there in the lumen of the stomach. So although digestion starts in the stomach, there's no nutrients absorbed in your stomach. Okay? So despite what it says on the TV when you take those aspirin tablets and they go down into your stomach and they're immediately making you feel all better, it doesn't really work that way. They got to get out of your stomach and into your intestine before they really start being absorbed. Okay. So now we're going into the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum, and indeed over 90% of all of our absorption, bringing the stuff home, all this food we've worked so hard to buy at the grocery store and cook and chew and eat and digest, now it's time to start bringing it into our body. Remember I told you at the beginning that the GI tract was sort of like a tube from your mouth to your butt, and the stuff that's in the tube isn't even part of you. It isn't part of you until it gets absorbed across the wall, and the absorption takes place here in the small intestine. Now the reason this is only 90% instead of 100% is because there's a little bit more that's absorbed in the colon. But that's very little. Mostly it's just water that we absorb in the colon. Okay, 3 parts to the small intestine. First one is called the duodenum, and oh shoot, did something bad. I know I did. So if this is the end of the stomach, here's the stomach up here, here's the duodenum. In humans, the duodenum kind of makes a curve, and then it comes out this way, and this becomes the jejunum right here. So this is the duodenum. The duodenum is only about that long. What?
10 inches or 25.
Yeah, it's about 10 inches or 25 centimeters long. How did you know that?
My book, actually.
Oh, that's wonderful. And look, it's right there on that slide, too. Yeah, okay. So anyway, The duodenum is kind of a mixing bowl because it's getting this super acid stuff out of your stomach, and it's got to mix it with two other things that are very important that empty right here into the duodenum. There's this tube that comes in here. This is the liver, bile duct, common hepatic duct, common bile duct, gallbladder, okay? Empties in through this little valve. There's a little valve here which is called the sphincter of Oddi. At least that's what we always called it. Never heard it called anything else. S-P-H-I-N-C-T-E-R of Oddi.
He's Garfield's friend.
He's Garfield's friend, that's right. Oddi. Or it's called the duodenal papilla. Yeah. Now the duodenal papilla and the duodenal, this valve right here is very interesting because not only does it get the bile from the liver, which I've drawn in right there, but it also gets the pancreatic juice, which comes from the pancreas. So there's one main pancreatic duct. This really goes around back. Let's draw it coming around in back, and it meets with this pancreatic, and it goes in right there together. You've got a nice picture in your book, I think I'll get to it here in a minute, that shows how the two of them come together. We call that the common channel. There's this tiny little channel where both the bile and the pancreatic juice come together. And they mix in there with the stuff that's in the duodenum because the juices from both of those are actually alkaline. The bile from the liver is alkaline, and the pancreatic juice from the pancreas is even more alkaline. That they mix with the food, the chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. That's the name given to whatever's in the gut from here on down until you get to your rectum, I guess, then you call it stool. Okay, so after it goes to the duodenum, then it hits the jejunum, and let's just say that the jejunum is the most important part of the small intestine for absorption, and it's where most of your absorption goes on. It's pretty long, 8 feet long, you know, you could jump rope with it. It's just the jejunum. So it's where most everything happens, is in the jejunum. You don't think about your jejunum very often. Your mother never told you how important your jejunum was to you as a child, but yet it is. And I've seen a few patients that didn't have one, and it's a disaster. The location, most of the chemical digestion, most of the nutrient absorption occurs right here in the jejunum. The wall of the jejunum has got lots of villi. It says it has few plicae circulares, but believe me, it's pretty windy on the inside. As illustrated right here. Here's what plicae circulares look like. They're just infoldings of the mucosa in order to create more surface area. Gives you more areas to absorb stuff through. And then we finally get into the third portion of the small bowel, which is called the ileum. And the ileum is pretty good size too. I'll make it in another color for you. And it comes on down here. And the ileum then enters into the colon over here. And we'll add it on here in a minute. Here's the colon coming off the butt of this is called the cecum. You remember the cecum from your rat dissection in first day of A&P? A little appendix hanging off there. Our cats don't have appendixes, but we do. Uh-oh. Did it again? Yeah. So there's the plicae circulares. The book makes a big deal out of this, and I think it's really stupid. It says that these plicae circulares don't disappear when the intestine fills. In other words, they don't just stretch out and go away. Okay. The villi in the intestine, and this is really where all of the digestion, all of the absorption is going to take place. There's lots of these little finger-like projections that stick out into the mucosa, from the mucosa into the small intestine. And they're all covered with microvilli. So not only have they got villi, which are bumps, but on each of those bumps there's lots of little microvilli as well, all intended to just create more surface area so that we can absorb more sugars, more fats, more proteins across the membrane and get them into our body. A couple of things that you ought to notice. There are glands in the small intestine. There's lots of goblet cells, which are basically mucus cells. And you'll see those when you look under the microscope at any of these parts of the small intestine. The crypts of Lieberkuhn. Now I don't know why we leave this eponym in here and don't take all the others out, but there it is. These are kind of the little openings from the intestinal glands. I'll show them to you in a minute. And it's also where the brush border enzymes, and let me just explain that term to you. Brush border enzymes, what does that mean? Well, the surface of the small intestine sort of looks like a brush because it's got so many villi and microvilli sticking out into it, okay? And the whole idea is there's to create all this extra absorptive area. Well, there's a lot of enzymes that kind of hang out right along in there, in those cells that help digest the food and bring it in to you. And we call them brush border only because that's where they live. They live right there along that brush border between the lumen of the bowel and the wall of the bowel, the cells of the bowel. So here's the plaque circularies that look like this. They go transversely. Here's the villi, and then on top of each of those villi is lots of microvilli as well, as illustrated right here on this. I think there's nothing very exciting about this picture, nothing we need to talk about. We've discussed this basic structure of the wall of the GI tract earlier, and sure enough, everything there is the same. Remember that the longitudinal layer is on the outside, and the circular layer is on the inside. So if I only showed you this part of the picture over here, you'd still know that this is longitudinal and this is circular. And if I only showed you this part of the picture, you'd still know that this is circular and this is longitudinal, right? Even though you don't know which way the bowel is oriented unless you see the whole thing, right?
Yeah, and on the stomach slides, are we able to see the oblique as well?
Sort of. But there's so many other things about the stomach that make it so different. But yeah, you usually can see some oblique fibers. Obliques is not a complete band. Okay. Another thing, let's talk about these microvilli for a second here. Here's the surface area up here. These are mucus cells or goblet cells, which you won't have any trouble identifying when you look at them under the microscope. The area under here is called the lamina propria, where these blood vessels run. And please notice that there is an artery carrying bright red blood into this. There is a vein bringing dark blue blood out of it. There is a little nerve that's coming out of that. I'm not sure how significant that is. But there is also a lacteal. This green thing is a lymphatic channel. And you remember the lymphatic channel from back in 232? It's kind of a one-way stream that picks up extra fluid, brings it back up through the thoracic duct, remember, and dumps it into the junction up here of the subclavian and the jugular. So you have these lacteals, and notice that the lacteals have these little valves in them so things can't go backwards. Now, the lacteals, remember, are going to go back there into the belly and get in with those lymphatics and then head up towards the neck up here. They're not going to go straight to the liver. Okay, like we're going to find that most of the rest of this blood goes to the liver to get the food to get digested out of it. The thing that I find so fascinating about these lacteals is these lacteals are actually able to absorb complete fat droplets. So if you have fat out here in your bowel, and it goes down here through the small intestine. The way that our body brings fat into our system is actually bringing full little droplets of fat are absorbed straight into the lacteals. And then from the lacteals, they go up here to the neck and go into the venous system, and you've got fat droplets floating around in your blood, which you're going to eventually digest. But that's an important point, is that fat is actually absorbed straight through the walls of the lacteals and into the lymphatic system.
So it's absorbed that way, and it's also absorbed by emulsion through the bile?
Emulsion, let me talk about emulsion when we get to the bile in just a minute, okay? Emulsion just breaks it up. You know how when you have, let me just tell that story in a minute. Okay, so here's a nice little picture of one of these things. You notice there's little capillaries, little blood vessels. Here's a lacteal in here. Lots and lots of mucus cells or goblet cells around the surface. These brush border enzymes I talked to you about, their job is to expedite the final breakdown of this stuff so it can be absorbed through the brush border, through this this mucosa of the small intestine. Yeah?
Brush border enzyme is produced by microvilli.
They're produced by the cells that line the bowel, yes, which are covering the microvilli. I think here's a couple of examples of these. Here's one called an enteropeptidase. In other words, it's a small bowel peptidase. In other words, it lives in the small bowel along the brush border, and it breaks down peptides. It says here it activates pancreatic proenzyme trypsinogen. Trypsinogen is an enzyme secreted by the pancreas that trypsin breaks down proteins, right? Neuroendocrine cells, these are more hormones. All these neuroendocrine cells occur in the wall of the bowel, mostly up in the duodenum like I talked about, and they produce these hormones such as gastrin, cholecystokinin, and secretin. We've already talked about secretin, and we've already talked about gastrin. We have not yet talked about cholecystokinin. Another weirdo thing that you need to be sure and identify under the microscope is the duodenal glands. And this is what I got off track earlier on. I was talking about the duodenum needs all this extra protection because it's getting this acid poured right into it. And indeed, the duodenum has a set of glands that no other piece of the bowel has. And these are submucosal. They're just under the mucosa, but they're really obvious once you've seen them. They are called Brunner's glands, and they make copious amounts of mucus to coat the inside of the duodenum with mucus so that acid, which is being dumped out of the stomach, doesn't burn the wall of the duodenum. They're called Brunner's glands, yeah. Brunner, see? Named after Dr. Brunner. Weird. All right, let's talk about these. So there's all this water and all this secretions, all this mucus and all this stuff that's being secreted into the small intestine in order to then break down your food for you. And indeed, that amounts to about 1.8 liters a day. That's almost 2 big IV bags full of fluid is dumping into your intestine to help you